Okay, we should be okay now. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're watching this program. I just want to say thank you for having me. Certainly want to thank Humanities Kansas. As always, have been a great supporter of my work. Also, the Wichita Public Library. And I've been there several times, and I've just really enjoyed coming to Wichita. It's a great baseball city, great traditions, and the home of one of the three greatest, we say, Midwestern tournaments in America, and are certainly the longest lasting. So since I mentioned the other ones, I want to say the Denver Post tournament was the other one, and another one was the Council Bluffs tournament. But when it comes to the tournaments of all tournaments, we're talking about the National Baseball Congress tournament that started in 1935 in Wichita, Kansas. So I'm happy to do that and talk about that this evening. Also, I want to thank Sarah Dixon, who helped put this program together, who I corresponded with for months. And so thank you, Sarah, amongst other things. So because I know everybody wants to get into a little baseball tonight, no use putting it off for much longer. So we're going to get right into baseball. Okay, so we can go to the next slide here. And we've got a little help here. We've got an assistant here. All right, there we go. And sometimes people want to know just a little bit about you. Maybe that's not a part of your bio. So I always bring out these couple of images here. First of all, I started collecting baseball cards back in 1964. And actually, it wasn't baseball cards that I started with, it was Beatles cards. And of course, the Beatles were the rage in 1964. And the Topps company issued a set of Beatles cards, but I made the mistake of taking them to school, and the teacher said, "These are not collectibles, these are toys." And she took my Beatles cards. And when I went back to the store, the only thing left was baseball cards. So I started collecting baseball cards. And a lot of my history early on, I learned off the backs of baseball cards, even before I got a hold to books. So I owe a great deal of my legacy to baseball cards. And you can tell there when you start taking pictures with your baseball cards, you love them pretty much. And that's me way back. And you said I had a little more hair back then. So things have changed. And of course, the first article ever printed on me was not about me doing research, but it was about me being an African-American baseball card collector here. So I started off on the plains of Kansas and started collecting baseball. I'm originally from Kansas City, Kansas. And so it's quite fun for me to talk about Kansas baseball history. So we'll go to the next slide. And during the 1920s, of course, the Kansas City Monarchs started in 1920, but there were Black teams before then. Actually, the first ever Black baseball team organized in the state of Kansas was organized in 1907 in my hometown. The first professional Black baseball team. It was the Kansas City, Kansas Giants. So I know that area, and I grew up in that area and that kind of thing. But all of the great baseball players who came from Kansas through the years, many of them were able to play in the National Baseball Congress tournament. And I tell you, many of them who didn't get there, they sure wish they had it. And these are just a few that I have here. George Giles, I get a chance to talk about him quite a bit he's the one on the, it would be, I guess it'd be to your left here. And that he is originally from Junction City, or Dink Moffel, who's in the center picture to the left from Topeka, Kansas. And of course, Chet Brewer, who's a major name in baseball history from Leavenworth. So, and of course, my favorite, Wilbur Billy Rogan, right from my hometown, Kansas City, Kansas. So I've been my pleasure to write about all of these guys, and all of these players have great legacies that connect back to Wichita, some of them to the Denver Post, to the NBC tournament. Okay, and we go to the next slide. And as we start tonight, I just want to let everybody know that even if you don't follow baseball real heavily, we're all still kind of baseball fans, because baseball has had a way of kind of seeping into our American culture. And so one of the ways it's done that is with nicknames. So I always have a little fun with this. And, so when you look at nicknames, there are names that are iconic for everyone. So if I was to mention the name Yogi, what would you say? Bear, yeah. And what if I said Mickey? Probably Mantle comes to mind. How about the Babe? Think of George Herman Ruth. How about Shoeless? Joe Jackson gets a lot of press. Of course, Dizzy Dean. And how about Pee Wee? Pee Wee Reese. And, I was somewhere and I said Pee Wee, and a lady in the crowd said Herman. I got quite a laugh out of that, especially when I realized she was 80 years old. So we'll go to the next slide. And when you're talking baseball, it's important, most of us grew up where we didn't have baseball on TV every night. You might get a game of the week. I can remember the Royals were broadcasting 14 or 15 games, just to give you an example. So we had to learn how to talk baseball because we were picking it up on the radio. And so a lot of people who follow baseball, if you really want to follow the game closely, you have to learn the baseball language. And so you'll hear me talk of some words tonight that will be purely baseball language. But I think it's important that we keep this language going because when you listen to sportscasters, they will use a lot of these iconic terms. Some of them have worked their way into American culture. 3 strikes you're out. They use that in everything. So just know that baseball has its own language. And so I'll be speaking a little bit of this language tonight. Go to the next slide. And one thing I might mention in the National Baseball Congress tournament didn't start officially till 1935, but Wichita was already a great city. Of course, they had the Wichita Western League team. And of course, the Monarchs came and played them there as early as 1922 and actually beat them in a series of games. And so there's a great legacy that leads up to the period that starts the National Baseball Congress tournament. And of course, Wichita had its own team, and I know they've done a Zoom on that subject, which was the Monrovians. And of course, some of the Monrovians graduated to the Kansas City Monarchs. T.J. Young, one of them, Nelson Dean, a pitcher from Muskogee, Oklahoma, was another one. So just know that there was a great heritage leading up to it. Go to the next slide. The Kansas City Monarchs came to Wichita, and they used to go to Old Island Park. And they set the record, or actually, I think they were like second for the largest crowd that ever appeared there. And it was a game between the Kansas City Monarchs and the House of David. In 1933, it was the largest crowd. Then in 1934, they came again playing the House of David. And this is the House of David here. They were a religious team or out of Benton Harbor, Michigan. And you can see, I have to tell young people, these aren't hippies from the 1960s. These are really baseball players from the 1930s. And you'll see there, look below, you'll see the scripture that they use to legitimize them not cutting their hair. So, and of course, the Kansas City Monarchs came to Wichita and played the first ever night baseball game there in 1930 with their portable lights. The next year, the Kansas City Monarchs leased those lights to the House of David, and the House of David comes back and plays a night baseball game there. So the first ever night baseball game played in the state of Kansas was with the Kansas City Monarchs lights, and of course the next year, and it's going to be in Wichita as well. So Wichita, once again, I'm just kind of expanding on this history to let you know of all of this important information that leads up to the tournament. Okay, and then we'll go to the next slide. And important to the tournament, because they helped many teams get there, are J.L. Wilkinson. And J.L. Wilkinson was a co-owner of the Monarchs, along with T.Y. Baird, who's going to be on the right-hand side. And then one of the greatest promoters of all time, who gets little recognition, was a promoter by the name of Ray L. Doan out of Muscatine, Iowa. And these guys worked with Lawrence Dumont and helped get teams to the tournament. And of course, the teams that came to the tournament throughout the summer, these would be the Monarchs competition. So they're going to go to Enid, Oklahoma. They're going to play the Enid team. Of course, the Enid team would come down many years to the tournament, especially in the 1930s. And they're going to play the Halliburton team. And so there were many teams around the country that's going to play these African-American teams prior to getting to the tournament. So I just want to touch on that, and we'll go to the next slide if we can. And, you know, I just mentioned Ray Eldon. And Ray Eldon in 1934, you guys got a new stadium there in Wichita, which was the Lawrence Dumont Stadium. It replaced the old Island Park Stadium, and it's a great new park. And so they wanted to do big things there. And so in the fall of 1934, they bring in Dizzy Dean. And of course, the promoter for that tour was Ray Eldon, T.Y. Beard, and J.L. Wilkinson. So they're going to come to Wichita, and they only went to 14 cities in the whole United States. They ended up in the East, in Paterson, New Jersey. They went to New York. They were in Pittsburgh. But why Wichita? They came to Wichita because it was simply the greatest baseball team, the greatest baseball scene in the state of Kansas. So, and of course, when we talk about that first tournament, 1935, the Bismarck team came down and they brought with them a integrated team. Now, this is a whole new revelation because in 1934, the Denver Post Tournament introduced a mixed team. And so they had Satchel Paige and also a catcher named Bill Perkins. And they came in the uniform of the House of David, who won the 1934 Denver Post Tournament. But it upset a lot of people. So the next year, there were no mixed teams. But Wichita took the banner, basically the banner, and became the next city that began to feature mixed teams. I might also mention the 1934 Denver Post Tournament had the House of David with the mixed team, but they only had one other Black team in the tournament. When Wichita started their tournament, they had at least 5 Black teams in the tournament, including a mixed team, which was the Bismarck team, who goes on to win the tournament. Of course, Satchel Paige, the great Satchel Paige. I could spend a lot of time talking about him, but you might want to do some research if you don't know much about Paige. But when he came to the Denver Post Tournament in 1935, he set the tournament record for the most strikeouts. And believe it or not, guys, that tournament is still continuing. And would you believe that no one has broken Satchel Paige's record yet? And that record was 60, I think he has 60 strikeouts in 4 games. And that's still a tournament record. And how about this? Double Duty Ratcliffe set the record for the most putouts. And he was Satchel Paige's catcher in 1935. And his record for the most putouts in a tournament has also not been broken. So this is great history. But most people, when they talk about the Wichita tournament, it all stops with Satchel Paige. And so I go places and most people know that Satchel Paige played there, but they don't know much else about the tournament. And so I just want to mention a few other things about the tournament as we talk tonight. So first of all, let's go to the next slide. I want to talk about some of the local players. For instance, here's one here, and I used this photograph in a recent book of mine, which was the Dizzy and Daffy Dean Barnstorming Tour, because when Dizzy came and pitched at the stadium, Lawrence Stadium, which is what they called it then, when it first opened, when he pitched, his catcher was this guy, A.C. Mickey Flynn. Now, what's interesting is that's all I've been able to find. I have not found any more information about his real name. I've just picked up these initials. But he was catching in Wichita, and there was a team called the Wichita Waterworks who played in the tournament year after year. And Ray Eldon was so impressed with him that the following year, 1936, he signed him to play with the House of David. And I was able to find a photograph of Mickey Flynn from Wichita, who playing for the House of David in 1936. Now, what's interesting, if anybody happens to know who this Mickey Flynn is, please get in contact with me. I would love to continue building on this history. We'll go to the next slide. And then also here, you're going to have some great players coming from Wichita, both Black and white. And so I just featured 3 who came out of the 1920s and the 1930s. One of them is Andy Cooper. And of course, Andy Cooper is going to be on the left side. Andy Cooper started in Wichita. He was originally from Waco, Texas. He moved to Wichita and still has family there in Wichita to this day. But he was raised pretty much around Wichita, and he played for teams there. And when they started the Negro National League in 1920, he was taken straight from Wichita to the Detroit Stars. Long story short, today Andy Cooper is a member of the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame, but he's from Wichita. Also, Ralph Weingartner. And Ralph Weingartner, just another player, I think it switched back there. We can go back to Ralph Weingartner. Ralph Weingartner is one of the local Wichita players. And you know, one thing about baseball, and we just have to talk about it, if the black players had to go play in the Negro leagues, and the white players could go on to the minor leagues or to the major leagues. And this is Ralph Weingartner, local guy from Wichita, who goes on, plays with several major league teams, also becomes a manager in the minor leagues in his latter part of his career. And then on the right, the extreme right, is T.J. Young, Thomas Jefferson Young. And of course, he started out with the Monrovians and later ended up with the Kansas City Monarchs. And so most people have never seen a picture of a Monrovians player. So this is actually one, and this was T.J. Young. He was a catcher, and he was there on the night that they played many important games in that black-owned park right there in Wichita. So just such a great legacy. We'll go to the next slide. And then most people don't realize in 1935, they brought a lot of black teams in to play the tournament. Now, what was interesting is they did bring black teams into the tournament, which was far ahead of the Denver Post tournament. And of course, the tournament in Council Bluffs had started bringing black teams in even before the Denver Post tournament. But what they would do in Wichita was a kind of a, I guess you might say, they would play the black teams against each other in the early rounds. So they would usually eliminate themselves. And so, for instance, the year that Bismarck came down, their first game was played against the Monroe Monarchs. So the Monroe Monarchs were an African-American team. And they, of course, they had Hilton Smith, who jumped over and played with them, even though he had been playing with Bismarck, but he originally came from Monroe, so he went back to Monroe for the tournament. And then, of course, they had another black team called the San Angelo Black Sheep Herders. And of course, they played the Memphis Red Sox in the opening tournament game. So they're eliminating each other before they get to the white teams. So only the cream of the crop was going to make it that far. And of course, the CLAYBROOK Tigers were there in 1935. And this is a picture of the CLAYBROOK Tigers out of Claybrook, Arkansas. They had a number of players from St. Louis on the team. And of course, here's Doc Bracken later on. I interviewed Doc Bracken. And one thing I haven't mentioned, I haven't stressed it a lot, but I had an opportunity to interview many people who played in the Wichita tournament. And for most of them, it was the highlight of the summer season to get down there, because you're going to play teams from all over the United States. And so anyway, this is Doc Bracken. He has some really great things to say about the tournament. We'll go to the next slide. And of course, you probably heard of John Buck O'Neill. Buck O'Neill was there in the 1935 tournament with the Denver White Elephants. And they were essentially an all-star team. They had played in the Denver Post tournament. And of course, the Denver Post tournament was prior to the Wichita tournament. So they were able to put a team together and come down to the Wichita tournament. So Buck O'Neill, in his early career, long before he got to the Kansas City Monarchs, which he doesn't get to the Monarchs until 1938, but by 1935, he's already in the Wichita tournament. Interesting thing, his team, when they came the first year in 35, it was the only black team that opened up, not playing against another black team. So anyway, we're still in 1935, talking about that first year. And of course, Hilton Smith was there. And if you've never heard of Hilton Smith, he was by 1937, the Kansas City Monarchs star pitcher. And by the way, today, Hilton Smith is a member of the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame. So in case you've never heard of Hilton Smith, he got his start in Wichita long before he got to the Kansas City Monarchs. And that's an important history. So we go to the next slide. All right. And, I might also mention as well, we know this was the era of segregation. And so a couple of interesting things I'd like to point out. They had in Wichita, and Wichita is a pioneering city in race relations. They were far ahead of some other places in Kansas. And I just wanted to give you a couple examples. One of them was the National A.AU Tournament in 1939. Now, prior to that, in 1939, a Black amateur fighter could not fight an amateur white fighter in the state of Kansas. And they started the A.AU National Tournament, and it was held in Wichita. And it was the first time that a Black fighter, amateur, non-professional, could fight a white fighter in the state of Kansas. And of course, the gold gloves were being popularized at that time. And a Black fighter or a white fighter, in order to meet each other, they would have to come to Missouri. So Wichita opened that door. And then I might also mention, you say, okay, this is the era of segregation. If you got all these Black teams coming to Wichita, where did they stay? Because, the tournament lasted, several days, sometime, at least a week. And so you stayed there till you got eliminated. So I might mention that these were two of the places that the Monarchs stayed. The Water Street Hotel. This is where the Kansas City Monarchs stayed frequently when they came there. And of course, the Oklahoma House was another hotel. I actually had the address on that one. And the Oklahoma House was actually featured in the Green Book. So this is where they stayed. Now, the white ball players could stay at any of the hotels in town, but the African-American players were limited as to where they could stay. So I just thought I would point that out in case that question came up later on. We can go to the next slide. And over the years, there were some great things that happened in the tournament. First of all, you started to get a lot of tournament MVPs. And some of these people I had a pleasure to interview. And one of them was Riley Stewart. I had a chance to meet Riley. He was up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And Riley came down in 1945 with the Sioux Falls Marauders. And the Marauders were a military team. And when they came down, they picked up Riley, this is, during the war years. And so they picked up actually two players. Bowen was the other African-American player, and they picked up Riley. But when they got to Wichita, the tournament people wanted to usher them off to separate hotels. And so the Marauders team said, well, if he can't stay with us, then we're not going to play. Long story short, Riley Stewart broke down the segregation in the hotels in 1945 with the team coming down from, of all places, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And of course, right next to him is the 1947 tournament champion, or the MVP, and it was WILMER Fields. And every year there would be an MVP selected by the tournament. And several of those MVPs turned out to be Black African-American ball players who played in the Negro Leagues. And WILMER Fields, of course, played with the Homestead Grays and goes on to become the 1957 tournament MVP. One thing about it, the only MVP that I had a chance to see playing growing up was Chris Chambliss, who played for the Yankees. If you remember, if you're a Kansas City Royals fan, he hit the home run that took us out of the contention back in the 70s. Most people remember that. And that was Chris Chambliss, but he had been a tournament MVP. So just a great legacy there. So we'll go to the next slide. And of course, one of the earliest MVPs is Bill Ricks. And Bill Ricks was originally from the Philadelphia Stars. And he worked his way through the tournament, and in 1949, he was a tournament MVP. And even though we talk about Satchel Paige, who was the first tournament MVP, these men are largely forgotten and rarely seen when it comes to talking about tournament MVPs. We can go to the next slide. Pat Scantlebury. Scantlebury was a Panamanian, and he played in the tournament. And he was the tournament MVP in 1950. And what's interesting about all of these tournament MVPs is that they were all African-American pitchers as well as great hitters. And so it just shows the diversity of this tournament and what we were watching and what we were seeing, and probably in some cases, what has been taken for granted in this really unique and wonderful tournament. So we'll go to the next slide. And I thought I would mention this team here. By the time you get to the 1960s, you have fully integrated teams, and most people are not paying much attention to it. But some of the teams would recruit guys who were down from the big leagues. And one team I wanted to mention was the Wichita Dreamliners. And this was a company out of Wichita, and they operated a bus line, and they were called it was called the Dreamliners Bus. So they had a team there, and they had on their team Bob Boyd, who played for the White Sox. Of course, he started in the Negro Leagues, and Bob Boyd, and then we got Tom Borland, and then also Jim Pendleton. And you can see from their Topps baseball cards, they were actually in the major leagues as well. So the teams that won the tournament, and some of them were based in Wichita, would recruit big time players to come down and maybe work at the factory. In Bob Boyd's case, he drove a bus and later on became a bus driver in the city of Wichita. But he started off with the Dreamliners. And of course, he was a tournament MVP in 1965. And Bob Boyd, of course, originally from Memphis, Tennessee, or maybe he was born in Potts Kent, Mississippi, a little small town. But he made his home in Wichita, and he lived there till he died. And so, but it was the tournament that got him there and playing with the Dreamliners. So these are just a few of the people I want to touch on. I'll touch on just a couple more, and then we'll go and answer some questions. Go ahead. All right, well, I guess we're ready to answer some questions here. This is a small sampling of the things that happened at the tournament and some of the people who participated in the tournament and brought diversity to the tournament. And we just touched on a few. One thing I did not touch on as much is the names of the teams that came there. And a lot of these teams represented big time corporations that are still in existence today. And you know, it's just a wonderful history. And of course, the tournament is still going, and probably the diversity is going as strong as ever. So let's go and go to a few questions. I don't know if you have some, but I'll be happy to answer them if I can.
Hi, Phil. The question I had is, what were the social and political climate like in Wichita in the time that allowed for this integrated play to happen as compared to other towns that might not have let it happen? Like, what made Wichita so special that this was permissible, this was allowed to happen there? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, well, I know Wichita was it was a good baseball town, and it was baseball crazy for one. And so they were able, by location, to get all kinds of teams as they crisscrossed the Midwest. If they were coming from Oklahoma, trying to get to Kansas City, Wichita. If they were trying to get to Omaha, coming from, you know, maybe points in the South, Wichita was just a darn good location. So Wichita benefited from all of those great teams who were barnstorming across the country. And that's why they had teams like the House of David, and of course, the Kansas City Monarchs played there frequently.
Sorry, I'm looking in the chat. You brought up the company. Can you talk some more and elaborate on the private companies that had teams? I know, like the Coohagany Lard Company, which is where the Cargill factory or the dog food on North Broadway, they had integrated teams, right?
Yeah, well, the one that jumps out to me, they weren't integrated, was the Halliburton team. And of course, the Halliburton team, I'm trying to think how I connected legitimately. You might say the descendant of the Halliburton team was still providing weapons to the United States and building weapons, you know, for Iraq. So that is one company that really stands out. Of course, Boeing always had teams in there. Of course, you know, they're connected to Wichita big time. But yeah, those are two that stand out for me.
Gretchen in the chat asks, did Mexican American and Native American teams play black teams? And like at the tournament, there were also Asian American teams too, as well, right?
Yeah, and you know, I'm probably not as good on the Asian American teams that came. So that I probably would defer that one. And I know the Enid, Oklahoma team had a pitcher by the name of oh shucks, his name was Milt. I'm trying to think of his last name, but his first name was Milt, and he played against the Monarchs quite a bit. Milt Perry, that was his name, and he was Native American, and he was their star pitcher for a number of years. And of course, Enid probably participated in a tournament in the 1930s, probably to the early 40s, maybe 7 times. And so Milt Perry is going to be with them. And he was probably the first great Native American pitcher to appear consistently at the Wichita tournament. And then what is the other part of the question?
Did the Mexican American and the Native American teams play the black teams?
Yeah, you know, there were Mexican American teams, I know, especially coming around in Texas, San Antonio, through there. Nothing stands out for me in knowing that any particular team came and played. Now, I could be wrong on that, but nothing stands out for me. It's a whole team.
Cindy was wondering what the A.AU refers to in the National A.AU tournament in the slide with the boxer. She was wondering what that was referring to.
Yeah, that was let's see, it was an American Amateur Association, United States Amateur Association. And of course, these guys would fight, and then they would go fight nationally, but they had to have an elimination tournament. And so they would always have to come to Kansas City. And what's interesting is the black guys would have to fight each other, and then the white guys would fight each other, and then they would come to Kansas City to kind of finish it off. But actually in 1939, when they broke down that barrier, it just changed the whole thing. And the guy I have here, his name is Tommy Campbell, who won the lightweight division that year in Wichita. And Tommy Campbell grew up across the street from me, and he was much older. He was born in 1920, a few years before I was born. But he actually won that year. And his mom, when I was a little kid, used to drive me to church in her car. So she's about 65 then, so when I was a little kid. So actually, I really know this ball player. I mean, I'm talking ball players, I'm talking baseball here. I really know this boxer. And he would go on, Tommy Campbell, to be ranked as the #2 lightweight in the world. And but he was there in Wichita. And so there's many things that you can credit to Wichita that don't often get credited to Wichita. And the A.AU tournament, 1939, is one.
So then another question was about women's involvement in the tournament. Were there also women teams that played in the NCAA or that played in the NBC tournament?
No women's teams. No women's teams were played in the tournament. I don't even think that, I could be wrong on this, but I don't think a woman has played in a tournament unless it was in modern times. You know, if you kind of follow baseball from the 1930s, it was a rough and tough sport, and played quite a bit different than today's game. And then you had teams like, if you talk about the House of David, the House of David was going to play every day. And so the House of David, they're traveling across country playing every day. And they did pick up a lady who was named Babe Dickerson, the Olympian, who would come in and pitch 1 inning for them. But if you can imagine playing in those wool suits and the wood uniforms and traveling across the country night after night, that'd be a pretty tough life for a woman. But Babe Dickerson did it for at least 2 seasons.
And that's I have a question too about the tournament. David asks, he says amateur athletic union still around today, and then he asks, didn't the ABC stand for American Baseball Congress Tournament?
Let's see, I always knew it to be the National Baseball Congress Tournament. I've never heard of the American Baseball Congress Tournament, but it could be two separate organizations. But Lawrence Dumont had the National Baseball Congress Tournament.
Was there like a level of novelty for attending the NBC tournament with like the House of David, and then you have white audiences but that might not have necessarily got to see non-white players before? Was that part of what brought people to the stadium, or was it just it was baseball?
Well, one thing that the tournament pretty much established is state champions. And so, for instance, in Chicago, you get the Palmer House Indians, which is an all-black team playing against, teams in Illinois for the state championship. So I would say it gave semi-professional teams something to shoot at to become state champions. Of course, if you were state champions, then you could participate in the tournament. So teams just didn't show up. You had to win your state tournament. And so I talked to a Palmer Wiggins who played with the Palmer House Indians, and Maurice Wiggins, excuse me, who played with the Palmer Indians. Hey, it was a highlight of their season to win the state tournament and get down to Wichita. It was just that. So yeah, the tournament changed semi-professional baseball in that way, because now everybody wanted to be the state champion. And if you became the state champion, you could go on to be the National Baseball Congress champion.
Someone has a question. We just got hit with a bunch of questions. Someone wanted to ask real quick, what's your research process like? Like, how did you find the picture of the Monrovian players, since there hasn't been a lot of pictures of them?
Yeah, well, I started, I'm 40 years into this. And in the case of T.J. Young, I knew his brother, Maurice. He went by Maurice Doolittle Young. His nickname was Doolittle. And at that time, he was living in Kansas City. And so I was able to interview Maurice. And of course, Maurice died back maybe 1987, 88, something like that. And so just meeting families and just researching and traveling around, I tell people, I talk about the 200 city tour I did from 2014 to 2019. And that was 200 cities, but every place I would go, I would meet people. And but most of the reason I have this knowledge and this information was coming from talking to people, doing research, and then also meeting people back in the 1980s and players who had actually played in the tournament or played semi-professional baseball, played in the Negro Leagues, or played with one of the many white teams. I just wanted to talk to people who played baseball, who loved it. I will mention one of the people who helped me the most out of the state of Kansas, especially around the Pittsburgh area, was Don Gutteridge. I talked to Don many times about baseball in that part of the state. And so, yeah, this information comes from a lot of different places and a lot of different interviews that I was able to conduct.
So we have a couple of comments I'm going to go through here. One person did say that Greg says he worked in the front office for the NBC Congress and the Wranglers at Lawrence Dumont Stadium from 95 to 2001. And to his knowledge, the only women who played on the field were the Core White Silver Bullets. He can't remember what year that happened, but it was possibly 96 or 97. Another person was wondering about the Water Street Hotel and was wondering, Water Street was where the Black Business Center Wichita was at the time, correct, is what they asked. And can you say more about whether it continued to serve people without regard to race after the 1945 first?
They mean talking about the hotel?
Yes.
Okay, as far as I know, I cannot find any reference to the hotel. Now, I will mention that Tom Baird, who managed the Monarchs, who was co-owner of the Monarchs, I have found receipts in his records going to the Watertown Hotel. But I would always ask players when they would go places, I would say, where did you stay? And then I would ask them things about the hotel. So I was able to pick up names of different hotels that they stayed at in places like Oklahoma City, and in some cities they never stayed. For instance, the Kansas City Monarchs played Salina, Kansas many times, and they would play a night game, and the game say maybe ended at 11 o'clock. But what the Monarchs would do is they would get on the bus and drive all night. And then the next day they would wake up in Denver where there was a hotel, and then they would play a couple of ball games in Denver. And so they would stay there at the ex-serviceman's hotel. That was the Denver hotel. So there's a great history in this hotels, and you know, people talk about the Green Book and how it had a lot of information. I tell you, some of these Black teams could have written the Green Book the way they traveled long before a Green Book ever existed. So it's just really interesting history.
And someone was wondering where your interviews are being held, or like archivally. Are those going to be at the museum in Kansas City, or do you have any other museums like the Kansas African American Museum in Wichita?
Yeah, you know, I taped a number of interviews going back to the 1980s. I have not decided what I'm going to do with those. I am doing some interesting things. Actually, I'm re-releasing a book on Buck O'Neill that's going to have actually where you can, using QR codes, you can scan it and actually hear Buck O'Neill talking from some of those interviews. So we're doing some interesting things. But yeah, I don't have the answer to that as of yet. So hopefully I'll have to make my decision too soon. But there's some great institutions out there who are doing some marvelous things with collecting American history. And I've been in touch with many of them through the years in doing research. And you guys have a fine library there. I've done research there related to the House of David playing there in the Monarchs, and I always have wonderful, wonderful support and doing research right there at the Wichita Public Library. So if I could publicly thank you, I would like to do that.
Yeah, you have to come check out the new place if you haven't yet. We've been.
Well, you know, last year before the pandemic, I was last February, I had the honor of speaking in the new. I'm not sure what you guys call it, but it was a new auditorium, and man,
the conference center, yeah.
Conference centers. Oh man, 3 large screens. Oh, it was fabulous. And when you come from speaking in a lot of historical societies, they don't quite have what you guys have there. That's pretty fantastic. And so looking forward to coming back there again when everything kind of quiets down with the pandemic.
We'd love to have you. Gretchen says, some civil rights historians believe sports and music were more significant change agents than civil rights protests. What do you think of that comment?
Wow, I think that they kind of go together. I think every little bit helps is what I have always looked at it. And a good example of that is in my Dizzy and Daffy Dean Barnstorming Tour book, I wrote about the Dockham protests. And the reason I wrote about the Dockham protests in that book is because in 1934, if you wanted tickets to the Dizzy Dean Barnstorming game that was going to be played at the new Lawrence Stadium in 1934, you had to buy your tickets at the Dockham drugstore. So it was a kind of a natural thing to talk about it. And yeah, I think that in many cases, the protest and the sports and also music as well, entertainment, it all goes together. And even in Wichita, there were some great African-American entertainers who made statements nationwide. Hattie McDaniels, accepting the Academy Award, made some great statements.
Supposedly Charlie Parker recorded one of his first albums at KFDI Studios.
That's big time.
Yeah.
And there was another athlete from there. His name was Hallie Harden. Hallie Harden was a college football player, also played shortstop for the Kansas City Monarchs, and later goes on to be a great sports writer in Los Angeles. Matter of fact, some of the things I found about Tommy Campbell, the boxer I pictured there, was written by Hallie Harden. And of course, Hallie Harden, no one ever connects him to Wichita, but yeah, he started out there. And And then, you know, one of the other ones, George Sweat out of, George Sweat was from, I'll call it, he's from Kansas. And he had a relative, his wife's sister's daughter was Martha Davis. And Martha Davis had a group called Martha Davis and Spouse. And they were connected to Wichita because that's where she was from. And they were a big time act in the 1950s on a lot of TV shows. And people aren't talking about these people. Also, I might mention Saul, let's see, what's Saul's last name? He was a Black Olympian, and he is buried in Wichita. So I'm drawing a blank on his last name right now. So, but Wichita has great history and a great legacy. And so it's something that needs to be talked about. And there's probably always going to be a lot of work to be done. And there was a lot of work to be done back then, but Wichita did some of it. So hats off to Wichita and the NBC tournament for all the wonderful opportunities they have provided for baseball players, generation after generation after generation.
And then we had a comment from Tim. He says the tournament sold a yearly guide every year starting in 1938 that summarized the previous year's tournament, included team photos and rosters as well as results.
That's correct.
And someone was wondering how they can get a hold of you and where are you based out of?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, on the first slide, if you can put up the first slide there, I have my website there, which is nlbalive.com. You can reach me there, and let's see, you can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @NegroLeagueMan. You can follow me there. Let's see, you can follow me on Facebook, Negro League author Phil S. Dixon. So I try to make myself accessible. And of course, you can always call the Humanities Kansas and they can run me down if you're in the state of Kansas and you would like for me to appear somewhere. And we do a wonderful program. I might mention I was in Junction City right at the start of Juneteenth, and I added something different to my show. I came out and played Lift Every Voice and Sing on trumpet solo. So most people didn't know I played the trumpet on top of it. So I'm just having a wonderful time talking about sports, and it's just so much out there that we need to be talking about and researching to tell a good American story. And the NBC tournament is a good American story.
Thank you. You're a wealth of knowledge, Mr. Dixon, and we appreciate having you at the library. And I just want to say thank you. And a couple other people have said thank you in the chat, and